The Financial Sense Midweek Edition with Jim Paplava. Delving in-depth with authors and experts into the key economic issues.
Joining me on the program is John Williams from shadowstats.com. And John, I want to pick up on something that you're going to be updating here for your subscribers shortly, hyperinflation. Because as we discussed last time you were on the program, it doesn't appear that there's any way out of this mess. And if you look at, your thesis is that we are heading for a hyperinflationary Great Depression, which is going to collapse the purchasing power of the dollar, the normal stream of U.S. commercial economic activity, and a collapse in the financial system as we know it, and maybe a political change. And I know that's your opening paragraph.
Right.
But if we look at 2013, John, one of the things that has surprised me in the last decade, beginning with George Bush, I think it was 2003, he added the drug prescription benefit at the same time he initiated a war in Iraq. So it harkens back to Lyndon Johnson's gun and butter program. We go through a financial crisis, and President Obama comes up with his $1 trillion stimulus program. But then on top of that, he initiates a new entitlement, which is going to kick in 2013, when like 30 million people that are uninsured now are going to be kicked into the system plus new taxes. So let's talk about this scenario, why you believe the outcome is pretty much cut in stone now as being hyperinflationary, because you still have deflationists out there.
And I can understand their viewpoint. My contention is that to have a massive deflation, you have to have a collapse in the money supply. You don't get a collapse in the money supply from a credit collapse. We've seen that. If I'm a bank and lunge $1 million and you spend that, it goes out into the system. In normal times, that would increase the money supply tenfold, give you $1 million. $10 million ends up in the money supply, but then the guy who's borrowed the money defaults, the bank tries to get it back. They can't pull that $10 million out of the system. What happens is a balance sheet gets impaired, and they can't lend as much money. That's generally what's happened here. So that you don't see the direct shrinkage of the money supply, but they don't lend as much money, and through attrition you start to see the growth soften, and with the money supply, which is what we saw, it actually turned negative. Now we're seeing it turn to the plus side again. We're up over 3% year over year now in M3, and it looks like it's heading higher as we go along here week by week. And in terms of the deflationist sphere, that you have them to get a money supply collapse, what has to happen there is that the banks have to go out of business, that people have to lose their deposits. That's what happened in the 30s. And that is what the Fed and also the Treasury will fight to the last dollar they can create, spend, guarantee, whatever they have to do. This isn't hypothetical. We saw this happen in August, September of 2008 with the Lehman crisis. Next week we'll be in a Great Depression if we don't do this. They weren't kidding. They were very close to a banking collapse there. We shouldn't have been at that position, but at that position, they did what they had to do. And you can't blame them for doing what they had to do, because the Fed's primary function is to support the banking system. The government's supposed to keep the economy reasonably healthy, flowing. This would have put us into a deflationary Great Depression like you had in the 30s, assuming that they did not back up the banks and the deposits. In the 30s, people lost their deposits as the banks went under. Now you have the FDIC, and you look at what happened in 2008. A lot of guarantees, well beyond anything that was covered by law. They're not going to let the system collapse. However, everything that they're putting in there to keep the system afloat is inflationary. So this is where we start to come into an inflationary outlook. You mentioned Bush and the Medicare prescription plan. That went onto the books in 2004. And what happened there, if you look at the government's GAAP financial statements, based on generally accepted accounting principles, the way a corporation has to report its finances. That one action, the overhaul of Medicare, added $8 trillion to the government's unfunded liabilities in that year. Net present value, that's how much money they had to have in hand to cover that going forward. They knew they could never cover that. It was unfunded at the time, yet they did it. And putting that in broad perspective, that was, at the time, was the same size as our gross federal debt, about $8 trillion. Now we're up over $15 trillion in the 7-8 years that have followed. I talked to people in the administration at the time that they were dooming us to a hyperinflation because there's no way this could be covered by taxes. Eventually the government would, I suspect, and in fact I'm virtually certain, would do what every other government that's gotten itself into that position has done, and that is that they print the money to meet the obligation. And that gives you the inflation and the hyperinflation. If we had not had the various crises in the last couple of years, you could have looked at the hyperinflation by the end of this decade as all these terrible forces came together to bankrupt the country. Right now we're seeing, as they're reporting with GAAP statements, an annual deficit of $5 trillion. That can't be contained. You can't raise taxes enough. You can't cut spending enough. You cut every penny of spending, except for Social Security and Medicare, you'd still be in deficit if you wanted to bring that $5 trillion into line in 1 year. And that's just for 1 year. You have to do this on an ongoing basis. If you took 100% of people's wages and salaries, you'd still be in deficit. There's no way out of this shy of an extraordinary overhaul of the system, and the government's already shown it doesn't have the political will to do that. So, number one, we're doomed to a hyperinflation with the current political system that we have and the obligations in place on an ongoing basis that the government already has made. Now, moving it into the time frame, I'm looking at an outside time frame of 2014. It could be sooner than that. The various actions taken to stabilize a system following the near collapse of the banking system in 2008. All sorts of things were done to try and to stabilize things. But despite all the actions taken, the systemic solvency crisis in the banking sector, it's still there. We don't have much healthier banking system than we had then. We have a lot more government intervention and bank borrowing from the Fed. That's not resolved. The actions taken to stimulate the economy have done nothing of the kind. We're still seeing bottom bouncing after having had an unprecedented plunge, at least post-World War II, in economic activity from some point in 2006, a collapse into the early days of 2009, and then we've been bottom bouncing ever since. Some of the series seem to be recovering some. I mean, it's the retail sales adjusted for inflation and industrial production. They're picking up some, but they're both reliant on the government's inflation numbers. And if those inflation numbers are understated, and I'll contend that they are, those numbers inflation-adjusted numbers get overstated. If you break out economic indicators between those dependent on inflation and those that are not, the ones that are not, such as housing starts, there was 75% collapse in activity and you've been bottom bouncing. Non-farm payrolls, sharp decline in activity, plunging activity. There's been a little upward bounce in the officially reported numbers, but no meaningful recovery. And the level of payroll employment today is below where it was 10 years ago going into the 2001 recession. We're below the peak of employment going into 2001. We're well below the peak of employment seen going into the 2007 recession. And yet, if you look at the gross domestic product reporting, government claims that we've fully recovered from the recession, that the level of business activity today is above where it was before the recession started. Nonsense. You're not seeing that in any of the numbers, including the government's reporting of industrial production or inflation-adjusted retail sales or the housing starts. There's no way you can have the GDP up there without having a reflection of that in the underlying series. Just not happening. Yet the positive GDP growth is the basis for the happy budget deficit projections going forward, and they're not real happy. I mean, it still shows disaster. But if you have a recession, ongoing recession instead of economic growth, the deficit numbers all of a sudden over the next 10 years get a lot worse.
Let me stop you there because I want to raise two issues. Back in 2005, you had talked to administration officials back then about this drug prescription bill, and you said that this was really going to blow the deficits out and lead to inflation, and they told you it's too far into the future to worry about.
That's right.
And then in 2010, to make matters worse, we pass Obamacare, which goes into effect in 2013, not to mention the onerous taxes. Mm-hmm. Are they thinking the same thing, John, that, well, we can just print some money? Because you talk about when Richard Nixon was offered advice and he was given the advice, Arthur Burns basically said, look, we can run these kind of deficits. The dollar can be ignored or sacrificed, because you're not going to lose domestic votes over that. Do you think the Obama administration is thinking the same thing? Because in one presidency, in one term, the president will have doubled the national debt.
Yep.
I mean, that's a significant feat to accomplish in just 4 years.
Well, you have a lot of people talking in the administration as though it doesn't make a difference. I don't know if they really believe that, or someone's deliberately trying to crash the system here. I've got to believe that they just don't have any idea as to what they're doing here, what they're really facing. I mean, certainly there are people in Washington who are well aware of what's happening. And there should be people in the administration that know that. But again, how widely spread that is, I can tell you that with what you're describing and with the deficit that otherwise gets blown up by the weak economy, you have a real problem there in terms of Treasury funding, because they're not going to be raising taxes to cover it, so they're going to first try to borrow it. And if they have bad auctions, which I'm virtually certain they're going to have very quickly, the lender of last resort becomes the Federal Reserve. And again, the Fed set precedent in just this last year with the quantitative easing too. The period of time they were involved there, they bought for their account a larger amount of Treasury notes than were issued by the Treasury for public consumption. They effectively monetized more than 100% of the Treasury debt. Now, the markets are so distorted and unstable, nobody really raised too much of a stink over it. You did see initially some dollar selling, but there's been a lot of work to counter that and to distract the markets from the dollar by pushing the crisis in Europe and trying to hit the euro and use the euro as a foil against the dollar. Nonetheless, I'll contend right now is in a position where, again, over the last year, global confidence in it has been destroyed by actions of the Fed and the government in Washington. And therein is your problem, because you're going to see a massive selling of the U.S. dollar, dumping the dollars. I don't know that we're going to get to 2013 without that, but certainly what happens then and what the Fed has to do to keep the system functioning, by that point in time, it should be savaging. And as it does so, that becomes highly inflationary. I mean, what we've seen the last year in terms of a little bit of a pickup in oil prices and gasoline prices, that was a direct result of the Fed's action against the dollar. There's a lot more of that ahead, and as the dollar weakens, you're going to start to see that inflation picking up. And as the inflation picks up, and as the global markets look to dump the dollar and the Fed looks to absorb them, very heavy monetization of the debts, you're going to see a pickup in money supply, you'll see big velocity, you'll see inflation from higher commodity prices as opposed to any kind of a pickup in economic growth. Just the worst of all worlds. And that will lead us into the hyperinflation.
John, aren't we seeing right now some evidence or some warning signs? And I can think of two. One, the U.S. lost its AAA rating.
Yep.
And two, the Fed is now blatantly and openly monetizing debt, whether it's QE1, QE2, and there's rumblings now that QE3 may be coming this year.
They have to do that.
Yeah, if this would have happened in the 70s, and I remember the 70s because that's when I first got in the business, anytime the money supply ramped up or Burns began to print more money, the interest rates went higher. So the fact already should be a warning to investors that the debt has gotten to be so large, it's no longer capable of financing it through the bond markets as we did, let's say, in the 80s, 90s, a bit in the last decade. So we've lost our AAA rating.
Right.
The Fed has already announced 2 rounds of quantitative easing. Its balance sheet has gone from $800 billion to $2.9 trillion. And that right there tells me that we're entering the end game, because that should tell you how desperate we are when the Fed has to monetize and the U.S. government deficit has gotten so large it can't be financed anymore.